Welcome to my first MMA by the numbers YouTube video. This is just a bit of a test run for you all before I start getting some regular stuff up, but with the main event this week being really interesting between Jon Jones and Thiago Santos, I wanted to get a little bit of a deep dive into the numbers. So these stats here are just over the last 5 years for Jon Jones, and for Thiago Santos, so much of his early career came against a lower level of competition, and he's had a lot of UFC fights. So I set the cutoff here 7 fights ago. That starts with his Jack Hermanson fight. It gives us a better idea of how he's fared against tough competition compared to some of those weaker fights early in his career. And the first thing that really obviously stands out is that there are a lot of areas in which Thiago Santos has better numbers than Jon Jones. Not all of them are super important areas, but a lot of them are pretty interesting. He has a clear edge in striking aggression, averaging over 11 significant strike attempts per minute, which is really high, and landing north of 6, which again, that's not a rate we see very often. For someone to be that aggressive striking and to land north of 50% accuracy is really impressive, and at the same time, it's almost more impressive when you look at the amount of damage he absorbs. Only 2.2 significant strikes absorbed per minute. That defense rate isn't great, but that's actually skewed a lot by ground and clinch strikes, which tend to land more accurately. If we just look at his distance striking defense over those last 7 fights, it's up to 65%, while his accuracy does drop some, but only to 45%. So he's landing about 10% more accurately than his opponents from distance. He's outlanding them almost 3 to 1. He already ranks 11th over his whole career in UFC history for significant strike differential per minute. That's how many more significant strikes he lands than he absorbs. And over these last 7 fights, that mark jumps way up. Looking at Jon Jones' past opponents, he's only fought 2 opponents who had differentials of even plus 2.0 per minute heading into that fight. The first was Glover Teixeira, who had a great plus 3.66 mark, but it only came across 5 fights, some low-level competition in there too. And the other was Daniel Cormier, and that came in only 4 UFC fights, 2 of which were at heavyweight, so still not against top light heavyweights. And Santos, admittedly, his marks do come against some weaker opponents as well, early on, like I said, and a lot of them have been middleweights, which we have to take with a bit of a grain of salt. But the fact that his differential is higher over his most recent fights against that good competition than it is over his whole career is really intriguing. Don't get me wrong though, Jon Jones' numbers are silly good. Looking at these ones that are just over his last 5 years, that's a 5-fight sample, but that's really just against the best of the best at light heavyweight, and he has dominated. He's not a super high-paced fighter, but he doesn't need to be. He averages 7.7 significant strike attempts per minute and only 3.9 takedown attempts per 15 minutes, but he is as efficient as you're going to get. 62% significant strike accuracy is crazy, and it doesn't drop too far if we just look at his distance strikes to 54%, which he combines with 66% significant strike defense. So that's 1% higher defense and 9% higher accuracy than Santos, even though those last 5 fights have pretty much exclusively been against killers. So while his landed strike ratio isn't as good as Santos, I mean, something above 2 to 1 against this level of competition is crazy. And it comes with elite defense, and it comes without a ton of pace, which is not usually something you see. A lot of fighters who are able to rack up big differentials are doing it while attempting, like Santos is, north of 10 significant strikes per minute. Jones is also a super efficient grappler, 38% takedown accuracy in a sample that includes Daniel Cormier, it includes Gustafsson, who has good takedown defense. I mean, that's still really high. It's not elite wrestling efficiency, but when you factor the level of competition, it still kind of is. And when he doesn't score the takedowns, we see him dominate in the clinch, hence the high landed strike differential. He's also got probably the best takedown defense in the UFC. Statistically, I believe it's top 5 over his career, and he has the highest takedown defense rate in UFC light heavyweight history, even though some of those fights are including matchups with, like I've said, Daniel Cormier. So no real concern that Santos takes Jones to the ground here. And there is concern on the other side, though, where Santos only has a 65% takedown defense rate. That's an area which he's shown to be exploitable a little bit in the past, and that could be a real issue. We saw Jon Jones not really want to mess around with Anthony Smith's dangerous striking and dominate him in the clinch and drag him to the ground repeatedly. That could be a game plan we see here. So if you're asking me to pick a winner for this fight straight up, it's almost impossible to pick against Jon Jones. He's just proven again and again that you don't want to pick against him, and especially when it's against an opponent like Thiago Santos, who has some real question marks. That takedown defense is a big concern, especially because a lot of those takedowns did come at middleweight, where he's fighting smaller opponents. Jones is huge, Jones is strong, he's one of the best wrestlers in the UFC. He should win this fight. But once we take a look at the betting odds, Thiago Santos is plus 475. That makes him a huge underdog, and you don't need to think he wins for him to be a good bet here. Plus 475 only implies that he's going to win this one about 17.4% of the time, and I think that's underselling him a little bit here. I don't like to get too excited about finishers, but Santos has consistently proven to be incredibly dangerous. He's got 11 knockout wins in the UFC, which is second only to Vitor Belfort with 12 in UFC history. Combining that finishing ability with great stats to back it up, though, an elite significant strike differential, that makes Santos different than a lot of Jones' opponents. He's dangerous in a different way. He's not just trying to pull out Hail Mary finishes like Anthony Smith sometimes does. He's got elite finishing ability and an elite ability to dictate the pace while fights are going on. That's something Jones excels at, so Santos could have some real issues with pulling that off, but that could keep this fight a little bit closer than we're used to seeing. At plus 475 on 5 dimes, I think there's a lot of value in betting the underdog in this fight with Thiago Santos.